Rabaul, New Britain, February 1943, 0800 hours. Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura stands on the balcony of his headquarters overlooking Simpson Harbor, watching as another convoy of transport ships unloads thousands of tons of supplies and fresh troops onto the docks below. The harbor bristles with warships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, all part of the massive 100,000-man garrison that has transformed this once sleepy Australian colonial outpost into the Gibraltar of the Pacific. Imamura has every reason to feel confident. Rabaul is the linchpin of Japan's defensive perimeter, a fortress so heavily fortified with anti-aircraft guns, fighter squadrons, and naval power that American planners have dubbed it impregnable. What General Imamura cannot possibly know, what no Japanese commander could imagine in their most anxious nightmares, is that within months, American strategists will do something that defies every conventional military doctrine. They will simply bypass Rabaul entirely. They will leave Imamura and his 100,000 soldiers to sit and watch as American forces leapfrog past them, island by island, cutting off their supply lines and leaving them to slowly starve on an island that will become their prison. The mighty fortress of Rabaul, which cost Japan enormous resources to build and defend, will be rendered completely irrelevant without a single American soldier setting foot on its beaches. This is the story of how America's island-hopping strategy, one of the most revolutionary military campaigns in history, stunned the Japanese Empire and changed the nature of warfare forever. It's a tale of strategic brilliance, brutal amphibious assaults, and the slow, agonizing fate of tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers left to wither on the vine, on bypassed islands across the Pacific. The roots of this strategy stretch back decades before Pearl Harbor, to a time when few Americans could even locate the Pacific Islands on a map. The year is 1921. Major Earl Hancock Pete Ellis of the United States Marine Corps sits in a cramped office in Washington, D.C., surrounded by maps of the Pacific Ocean. Ellis is a brilliant but troubled officer, a man whose genius is matched only by his struggles with alcoholism and depression. But on this day, his mind is crystal clear as he studies the strategic implications of Japan's new possessions in the Pacific. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles had awarded Japan control over Germany's former colonies in the Pacific, the Marshall Islands, the Caroline Islands, and the Mariana Islands. Ellis recognized something that few others did. These islands formed a defensive barrier that could cut off American access to its own possessions in the Philippines and Guam. If war came with Japan, American forces would face a nightmare scenario, trying to fight their way across thousands of miles of ocean, island by island, against heavily fortified Japanese positions. Ellis began drafting what would become one of the most prescient military documents in American history. Operations Plan 712, Advanced Base Operations in Micronesia. In this plan, Ellis outlined a strategy for systematically attacking and seizing Japanese-held islands across the Pacific. He envisioned amphibious assaults supported by naval gunfire, with Marines landing on hostile beaches to capture airfields and harbors that could then be used as stepping stones for the next advance. The plan was revolutionary. At the time, amphibious warfare was considered nearly impossible against a defended beach. The disastrous Gallipoli campaign of World War I had convinced most military planners that trying to land troops from the sea against machine guns and artillery was suicidal. But Ellis believed that with the right tactics, equipment, and training, it could be done. Tragically, Ellis would never see his vision realized. In 1923, he died under mysterious circumstances while on an intelligence-gathering mission in the Japanese-controlled Marshall Islands. Some historians believe he was murdered by Japanese agents who discovered his spying. But his plan survived him, and throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the Marine Corps quietly developed the doctrine, tactics, and specialized equipment that would make amphibious warfare possible. By 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States had a blueprint for how to fight across the Pacific. What they didn't have was the ships, planes, and men to execute it. That would take time. Time purchased with blood at places like Wake Island, Bataan, and Corregidor, as American and Filipino forces fought desperate delaying actions against the Japanese onslaught. December 7, 1941, changed everything. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and destroying nearly 200 aircraft. In the weeks that followed, Japan seemed unstoppable. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day 1941. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, surrendered in February 1942 in what Winston Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. The Philippines fell in May 1942 after a heroic but doomed defense. Wake Island, Guam, the Dutch East Indies, all fell to Japanese forces in a matter of months. By mid-1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching from the borders of India to the Central Pacific, from the Aleutian Islands in the north to the approaches to Australia in the south. It was the largest empire in Japanese history, and it seemed unassailable. Japanese propaganda proclaimed the creation of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a new order in Asia free from Western colonialism. But there were cracks in the facade. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, American carriers fought the Japanese to a tactical draw, preventing an invasion of Port Moresby in New Guinea. Then, in June 1942, came the Battle of Midway, the turning point of the Pacific War. American codebreakers had decrypted Japanese naval communications and knew exactly where and when the Japanese fleet would strike. In a battle that lasted just 5 minutes at its climax, American dive bombers caught 3 Japanese aircraft carriers with their decks full of fueled and armed aircraft. The resulting explosions and fires destroyed 3 carriers almost instantly. A 4th was sunk later that day. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and, most critically, many of its most experienced pilots. Midway shifted the balance of naval power in the Pacific. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Americans could take the offensive. But where to strike? The Japanese defensive perimeter was vast, and every island seemed to bristle with troops, aircraft, and coastal guns. A direct assault on the strongest positions would be suicidal. American planners needed a different approach. The strategy that emerged was born from necessity and refined through experience. Rather than attacking every Japanese stronghold in sequence, American forces would bypass the most heavily defended positions, seizing lightly defended islands that could be quickly turned into air and naval bases. From these bases, American aircraft could cut off the supply lines to the bypassed Japanese garrisons, leaving them isolated and impotent. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, and Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, developed complementary strategies. MacArthur would advance along the northern coast of New Guinea toward the Philippines, while Nimitz would drive through the Central Pacific, capturing key island groups that would bring American bombers within range of Japan itself. The strategy had several brilliant advantages. First, it allowed American forces to choose where and when to fight, attacking weak points rather than strong ones. Second, it maximized the use of American advantages in naval and air power while minimizing the need for costly ground combat. Third, it was faster than trying to capture every island. American forces could advance hundreds of miles in weeks rather than months. And fourth, it left Japanese garrisons stranded without supplies, slowly weakening them without the need for direct assault. But the strategy also had a darker side. The Japanese soldiers left on bypassed islands would face a slow, agonizing fate. Cut off from resupply, they would have to survive on whatever food they could grow or forage. Many would starve. Some estimates suggest that 60% or more of Japanese military deaths in the Pacific came from starvation and disease rather than combat. The Americans called it letting them wither on the vine. For the Japanese soldiers experiencing it, it was a living nightmare. The first major test of American offensive capability came at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. In August 1942, Marines landed on this jungle-covered island to seize a partially completed Japanese airfield. What followed was 6 months of brutal fighting on land, at sea, and in the air. The Japanese were determined to retake Guadalcanal. They poured reinforcements onto the island in nighttime runs by fast destroyers, operations the Americans dubbed the Tokyo Express. Naval battles raged in the waters around the island with such frequency that the channel between Guadalcanal and nearby islands became known as Iron Bottom Sound for all the ships that sank there. On land, Marines and later Army troops fought a grinding campaign against Japanese forces that attacked with fanatical determination. Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated with the Bushido Code that considered surrender dishonorable, fought to the death in banzai charges that sometimes overran American positions through sheer ferocity. American troops learned hard lessons about jungle warfare, about the importance of air superiority, and about the tenacity of their enemy. By February 1943, the Japanese had evacuated their remaining forces from Guadalcanal. The Americans had won, but at a cost of over 7,000 killed and thousands more wounded or incapacitated by malaria and other tropical diseases. The Japanese lost over 30,000 men, many of them to starvation and disease, as American control of the seas prevented adequate resupply. Guadalcanal proved that American forces could take and hold Japanese-occupied territory, but it also showed that direct assaults on defended positions were incredibly costly. The island-hopping strategy would need to be refined to reduce casualties while maintaining momentum. By mid-1943, American planners turned their attention to Rabaul, the massive Japanese base on New Britain. Rabaul had been transformed into a fortress, with 5 airfields, a deep-water harbor, and a garrison that would eventually number 100,000 troops. It was the key to Japanese control of the Southwest Pacific, the staging point for operations in New Guinea and the Solomons. Traditional military doctrine would have demanded a direct assault on Rabaul, but American planners, led by MacArthur and Nimitz, had a different idea. Rather than attack Rabaul directly, they would isolate it. This became Operation Cartwheel, a complex, multi-pronged campaign to seize islands around Rabaul, cutting it off from reinforcement and supply. MacArthur's forces advanced along the northern coast of New Guinea, leapfrogging past Japanese strongpoints to seize lightly defended positions. Each captured position became a new airfield from which American aircraft could strike the next target. Meanwhile, Nimitz's forces advanced up the Solomon Islands chain, capturing Bougainville and establishing airfields within bomber range of Rabaul. The strategy worked brilliantly. By early 1944, Rabaul was surrounded by American air bases. Hundreds of American bombers pounded the base daily, destroying aircraft, sinking ships, and making the harbor unusable. The Japanese garrison, once the pride of the Imperial Army, was reduced to growing vegetables and fishing to survive. By the end of the war, approximately 90,000 Japanese troops remained at Rabaul, having sat out the entire conflict after early 1944. The isolation of Rabaul demonstrated the power of the island-hopping strategy. A fortress that might have cost tens of thousands of American casualties to capture was instead neutralized without a single Marine setting foot on its beaches. The 100,000 Japanese troops at Rabaul were effectively prisoners of war, unable to contribute to Japan's defense. While MacArthur advanced in the Southwest Pacific, Admiral Nimitz launched the Central Pacific Campaign, a series of amphibious assaults across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The first target was Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands, November 20th, 1943. The pre-dawn darkness over Tarawa is shattered by the thunder of naval gunfire as American battleships and cruisers pound the tiny island of Betio. For 3 hours, shells rain down on Japanese positions. Carrier aircraft add their bombs to the bombardment. Surely, American commanders think, nothing could survive such devastation. But they are wrong. The Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki, has turned Betio into a fortress. His 4,800 men are protected by concrete bunkers, coconut log pillboxes, and an intricate system of trenches. When the bombardment lifts and the first waves of Marines approach the beach in their landing craft, they discover a nightmare. The tide is lower than expected. Landing craft ground to a halt on the reef, 500 yards from shore. Marines have to wade through chest-deep water under withering fire from Japanese machine guns and artillery. Men fall by the dozens, their bodies floating in the surf. Those who make it to the beach find themselves pinned down by a 4-foot seawall, unable to advance. For 3 days, Marines fought yard by yard across Betio. They used flamethrowers to burn out bunkers, explosives to blast through concrete, and raw courage to advance against an enemy that fought to the death. When the battle ended, 1,027 Marines were dead and 2,292 wounded. Of the Japanese garrison, only 17 soldiers and 129 Korean laborers survived. The American public was shocked by the casualties at Tarawa. Newsreel footage of dead Marines floating in the surf sparked outrage. Was the island-hopping strategy worth such a terrible price? But military planners learned crucial lessons from Tarawa. Future landings would have better intelligence on tides and reefs. Underwater demolition teams, the predecessors of Navy SEALs, would clear obstacles before the main assault. And most importantly, the pre-invasion bombardment would be longer and more thorough. The lessons of Tarawa were applied immediately in the Marshall Islands campaign. In January and February 1944, American forces seized Kwajalein, Eniwetok, and Majuro atolls. This time, the pre-invasion bombardment was devastating. At Kwajalein, American ships and planes dropped more explosives in a single day than had been used in the entire Tarawa operation. The results spoke for themselves. Kwajalein was secured in just 4 days with relatively light casualties. The Japanese garrison of nearly 8,000 men fought to the death, but American firepower and improved tactics overwhelmed them. Only 105 Japanese soldiers were captured alive. But the most significant aspect of the Marshall's campaign was what didn't happen. The Japanese had heavily fortified several atolls in the Marshalls, including Watje, Maloelap, Mili, and Jaluit. Traditional military doctrine would have required capturing these strong points. Instead, American forces bypassed them entirely. Cut off from resupply, the Japanese garrisons on these islands were left to starve. The fate of these bypassed garrisons reveals the brutal reality of the island-hopping strategy. On some islands, Japanese troops managed to grow enough food to survive, though in a state of constant malnutrition. On others, starvation was rampant. Soldiers ate grass, tree bark, and anything else they could find. Disease ran rampant through weakened bodies. Some garrisons lost more than half their strength to starvation before the war ended. While American forces advanced through the marshes, planners turned their attention to an even more significant target, Truk Lagoon in the Caroline Islands. Truk was Japan's main forward naval base, a massive anchorage protected by a coral reef and ringed with airfields. It was sometimes called the Gibraltar of the Pacific, or Japan's Pearl Harbor. In February 1944, Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 approached Truk with overwhelming force. 5 fleet carriers, 4 light carriers, 7 battleships, and numerous cruisers and destroyers. The fleet brought 500 aircraft. Japanese reconnaissance had spotted the American fleet, and most of the heavy warships had already fled to Palau. But dozens of merchant ships, transports, and smaller warships remained, along with hundreds of aircraft. On February 17th to 18th, 1944, American carrier aircraft struck Truk in what became known as Operation Hailstone. The results were devastating. American planes destroyed 270 Japanese aircraft and sank 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, and 32 merchant ships, a total of 191,000 tons of shipping. The harbor became a graveyard of sunken vessels. Today, Truk Lagoon is one of the world's premier wreck diving destinations, with dozens of Japanese ships still resting on the bottom. But more important than the physical destruction was the strategic impact. Truk, like Rabaul, was neutralized without a ground assault. The Japanese garrison was cut off and left to survive as best it could. The base that had been the linchpin of Japanese naval operations in the Central Pacific was reduced to irrelevance in just 2 days. By mid-1944, American forces were ready for their most ambitious operation yet, the invasion of the Mariana Islands. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were not just strategic objectives. They were within bomber range of Japan itself. Capturing these islands would allow the new B-29 Superfortress bombers to strike Japanese cities directly. The invasion of Saipan began on June 15, 1944. Over 70,000 American troops, Marines, and Army stormed ashore against a Japanese garrison of 31,000 men commanded by Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito. The Japanese had learned from earlier battles and had prepared an intricate defense in depth, with positions in caves and on the island's mountainous interior. The fighting was brutal. Japanese troops launched counterattacks with fanatical determination. On July 7th, Saito ordered a final banzai charge, the largest of the Pacific War. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers, many armed only with bayonets or bamboo spears, charged American positions in a 15-hour assault. They overran 2 American battalions before being stopped. Saito committed ritual suicide rather than face capture. But the most horrifying aspect of the Saipan battle was the fate of Japanese civilians. Thousands of Japanese civilians lived on Saipan, and they had been told by their government that Americans were barbarians who would torture and kill them. As American forces advanced, hundreds of civilians committed suicide, jumping from cliffs at the northern end of the island. American troops watched in horror as mothers threw their children off cliffs before jumping themselves. The battle cost 14,111 American casualties and virtually the entire Japanese garrison of 31,000. The capture of Saipan had immediate strategic consequences. When news of the island's fall reached Tokyo, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government fell. Japanese leaders understood that with American bombers now able to reach Japan, the war was effectively lost. But the military leadership refused to consider surrender, condemning Japan to another year of devastating warfare. As American forces fought on Saipan, the Japanese Navy made one last attempt to turn the tide. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa led a fleet of 9 carriers with 473 aircraft to attack the American invasion force. He hoped to catch the American carriers between his fleet and land-based aircraft from Guam, destroying them in a decisive battle. But American intelligence had broken Japanese codes and knew Ozawa was coming. Admiral Raymond Spruance positioned his carriers to intercept. On June 19th to 20th, 1944, the two fleets clashed in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The result was a massacre. American pilots, better trained and flying superior aircraft, shot down Japanese planes in droves. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 600 Japanese aircraft were destroyed while only 123 American planes were lost. American submarines sank 2 Japanese carriers, and carrier aircraft sank a third. Ozawa retreated with only 35 aircraft remaining from his original force of 473. The Battle of the Philippine Sea destroyed Japanese naval aviation as an effective force. Japan would never again be able to challenge American control of the seas. The path to the Philippines and to Japan itself was now open. I shall return. General Douglas MacArthur had made this promise when he evacuated from the Philippines in March 1942. Now, in October 1944, he was ready to fulfill it. The liberation of the Philippines would be the largest campaign of the Pacific War, involving hundreds of thousands of troops and lasting until the end of the war. The campaign began with landings on Leyte Island on October 20th, 1944. MacArthur waded ashore with the first waves, making good on his promise in front of newsreel cameras. But the Japanese were determined to hold the Philippines. They threw their remaining naval strength into a desperate gamble to destroy the American invasion fleet. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought October 23 to 26, 1944, was the largest naval battle in history. The Japanese plan was complex. A decoy force of carriers would lure the main American fleet away, allowing Japanese battleships and cruisers to attack the vulnerable invasion transports. The plan almost worked. Admiral William Bull Halsey took the bait and chased the Japanese carriers north, leaving the landing beaches protected only by escort carriers and destroyers. What followed was a series of desperate engagements. In the Surigao Strait, American battleships, many of them Pearl Harbor survivors, crossed the T of a Japanese force and destroyed it with devastating gunfire. Off Samar, escort carriers and destroyers fought a heroic delaying action against Japanese battleships, with destroyers making suicidal torpedo runs to protect the carriers. And in the north, Halsey's carriers sank all 4 Japanese carriers in the decoy force. When the smoke cleared, the Japanese Navy had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force. 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers were sunk. The Americans lost 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, and 3 destroyers. Japan would never again be able to challenge American naval supremacy. The liberation of the Philippines continued for months. Fighting in Manila in February 1945 was particularly brutal, with Japanese forces making a last stand that destroyed much of the city and killed over 100,000 Filipino civilians. But by March 1945, organized Japanese resistance in the Philippines was broken, though isolated units would continue fighting until the end of the war. While American forces advanced toward Japan, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers sat on bypassed islands, cut off from supplies and reinforcements. Their fate varied depending on the island and the resourcefulness of their commanders. At Rabaul, the garrison managed relatively well. The 100,000 troops turned to farming early and effectively, growing vegetables and raising livestock. While they suffered from malnutrition and disease, starvation deaths were relatively few. The garrison achieved what one Australian officer called virtual self-sufficiency, like a small, independent country. But other garrisons were not so fortunate. On Bougainville, approximately 2/3 of the Japanese garrison died from starvation. In mainland New Guinea, starvation deaths may have exceeded 90% in some units. Japanese soldiers ate anything they could find: grass, tree bark, insects, even leather from their boots. Disease ran rampant through weakened bodies. Malaria, dysentery, and beriberi killed thousands. Some Japanese soldiers resorted to desperate measures. There are documented cases of cannibalism, with starving soldiers killing and eating their comrades or enemy dead. Japanese officers who survived the war spoke of the horror of watching their men slowly waste away, unable to do anything to help them. The psychological toll was immense. Japanese soldiers had been taught that surrender was dishonorable, that they should fight to the death rather than face capture. But on bypassed islands there was no enemy to fight, no honorable death in battle. They could only wait and slowly starve, knowing that their sacrifice served no purpose, that they had been forgotten by the empire they served. When the war ended in August 1945, Allied forces began the process of repatriating Japanese soldiers from bypassed islands. What they found shocked them. On some islands, the Japanese garrison had been reduced to walking skeletons, barely able to stand. Others had maintained better discipline and organization, but all showed the effects of years of malnutrition and disease. As American forces closed in on Japan, 2 more island battles demonstrated both the effectiveness and the terrible cost of the island-hopping strategy. The first was Iwo Jima, a tiny volcanic island halfway between the Marianas and Japan. Iwo Jima was needed as an emergency landing field for B-29 bombers damaged during raids on Japan. The island was only 8 square miles, but it was defended by 21,000 Japanese troops under Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kurabayashi, one of Japan's most capable commanders. Kurabayashi had studied American tactics and knew that the traditional Japanese strategy of defending at the beaches and launching banzai charges was suicidal against American firepower. Instead, he ordered his men to dig in deep, creating an intricate network of tunnels, bunkers, and fortified positions. Every cave, every hill, every ravine was turned into a fortress. Kurabayashi told his men that they would not win, but they would make the Americans pay dearly for every yard of ground. The battle began on February 19, 1945. Marines stormed ashore expecting heavy resistance at the beaches, but the Japanese held their fire. Only when the beaches were crowded with men and equipment did Japanese artillery and mortars open up, turning the landing zones into killing fields. For 36 days, Marines fought yard by yard across Iwo Jima. They used flamethrowers, explosives, and tanks to reduce Japanese positions one by one. The Japanese fought from their tunnels and bunkers, emerging to attack and then disappearing underground. The volcanic ash made digging foxholes nearly impossible, leaving Marines exposed to Japanese fire. The iconic photograph of Marines raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi was taken on the 5th day of the battle. But the fighting continued for another month. When it finally ended, 6,821 Americans were dead and 19,217 wounded, the only Pacific battle where American casualties exceeded Japanese. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were captured alive. The rest fought to the death. Iwo Jima demonstrated the terrible cost of assaulting heavily defended islands, but it also proved the value of the island-hopping strategy. By this point in the war, American forces could choose which islands to assault and which to bypass. Iwo Jima was deemed necessary for the bombing campaign against Japan. Other islands, no matter how heavily defended, were simply bypassed and left to wither. The final and largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War came at Okinawa, just 350 miles from the Japanese home islands. The battle would last 82 days and involve over 500,000 American troops against a Japanese garrison of 100,000. Okinawa was different from previous battles. The Japanese had learned that they could not stop American landings, so they didn't try. Instead, they let American forces come ashore unopposed and then fought a defensive battle from prepared positions in the island's rugged southern terrain. The Japanese also unleashed a new weapon, the kamikaze. Thousands of Japanese pilots flew suicide missions against American ships, crashing their bomb-laden aircraft into carriers, battleships, and destroyers. The kamikazes sank 36 ships and damaged 368 others, killing nearly 5,000 American sailors. It was the highest casualty rate of any naval campaign in American history. On land, the fighting was brutal. Japanese troops fought from caves and fortified positions, making the Americans pay for every yard. Rain turned the battlefield into a sea of mud. The carnage was so intense that combat veterans from Europe said Okinawa was worse than anything they had seen. The battle also took a terrible toll on Okinawan civilians. Caught between two armies, tens of thousands died in the fighting. Japanese soldiers forced civilians to commit suicide or killed them to prevent their capture. By the time the battle ended on June 22, 1945, over 100,000 Japanese soldiers were dead, along with 12,000 Americans and as many as 150,000 Okinawan civilians. Okinawa was meant to be the final stepping stone before the invasion of Japan itself. American planners estimated that invading the Japanese home islands would cost 1 million American casualties and kill millions of Japanese. The carnage at Okinawa seemed to confirm these estimates, but the invasion would never come. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The island-hopping campaign was over. Looking back, the island-hopping strategy was one of the most successful military campaigns in history. In less than 4 years, American forces advanced from Hawaii to the doorstep of Japan, covering over 5,000 miles of ocean and defeating an enemy that had seemed invincible in 1942. The strategy succeeded for several reasons. First, it played to American strengths: industrial production, naval power, and air superiority, while minimizing the need for costly ground combat. Second, it was flexible, allowing commanders to choose where and when to fight. Third, it was faster than trying to capture every island, allowing American forces to maintain momentum and keep the Japanese off balance. But perhaps most importantly, the strategy was psychologically devastating to Japan. Every bypassed garrison represented thousands of soldiers who could not contribute to Japan's defense. Every captured island brought American bombers closer to Japanese cities. The strategy created a sense of inevitability, a feeling that no matter how bravely Japanese soldiers fought, they could not stop the American advance. The human cost was staggering. Over 100,000 Americans died in the Pacific War, with hundreds of thousands more wounded. Japanese military deaths exceeded 2 million, with perhaps 60% dying from starvation and disease rather than combat. Millions of Asian civilians died in the fighting or from Japanese occupation. When the war ended, Allied forces faced the task of dealing with the bypassed Japanese garrisons. On some islands, Japanese commanders refused to believe that Japan had surrendered, thinking it was an American trick. It took weeks or even months to convince them to lay down their arms. The condition of many garrisons shocked Allied personnel. At Rabaul, the 90,000 remaining Japanese troops were in relatively good condition, having successfully farmed and fished to sustain themselves. But on other islands, Allied forces found walking skeletons, men so weakened by starvation that they could barely stand. The repatriation process took years. Japanese soldiers were gradually shipped back to Japan, where they found a country devastated by bombing and occupation. Many struggled to readjust to civilian life. Some felt shame at having survived when so many had died. Others felt betrayed by a military leadership that had left them to starve on forgotten islands. Some Japanese soldiers never surrendered. The most famous was Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, who continued fighting on Lubang Island in the Philippines until 1974, nearly 30 years after the war ended. When he finally surrendered, he was still wearing his tattered uniform and carrying his rifle. He said he had known the war was over but refused to surrender without orders from his commanding officer. The island-hopping strategy changed warfare forever. It demonstrated that in modern war, the side with superior mobility and logistics could bypass enemy strongpoints rather than attacking them directly. This concept influenced military thinking throughout the Cold War and beyond. The strategy also highlighted the importance of amphibious warfare. The techniques developed in the Pacific, specialized landing craft, underwater demolition teams, close air support, naval gunfire support, became standard doctrine for amphibious operations. These techniques were used in Korea, Vietnam, and every subsequent American military operation involving amphibious landings. But perhaps the most important legacy was strategic. The island-hopping campaign showed that in a vast theater of operations, the side that could choose where and when to fight had an enormous advantage. By bypassing Japanese strongpoints, American forces maintained the initiative throughout the campaign, keeping the Japanese constantly off balance and unable to concentrate their forces effectively. For Japan, the island-hopping strategy was a nightmare. Every bypassed garrison represented a strategic failure, thousands of soldiers rendered useless without firing a shot. The strategy exploited Japan's fundamental weakness, its inability to sustain far-flung garrisons without control of the seas. Once American submarines and aircraft cut the supply lines, Japanese garrisons were doomed. The psychological impact on Japanese military leadership was profound. They had prepared for a war of decisive battles, where samurai spirit and willingness to die would overcome American material superiority. Instead, they faced an enemy that refused to fight on Japanese terms, that bypassed their strongest positions and struck where they were weakest. It was a form of warfare that Japanese doctrine had no answer for. As the sun set on August 15, 1945, and Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over radios across Japan announcing surrender, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers on bypassed islands heard the news with mixed emotions. Relief that the war was over, shame at having survived when so many had died, anger at a leadership that had left them to starve on forgotten islands. At Rabaul, General Imamura assembled his garrison and formally surrendered to Australian forces. The 90,000 Japanese troops who had sat out the war since early 1944 laid down their arms. They had been bypassed, rendered irrelevant by a strategy that had changed the nature of warfare. The island-hopping campaign was a triumph of strategic thinking, of choosing to fight smart rather than hard. But it came at a terrible cost. Over 100,000 Americans died in the Pacific, along with millions of Japanese soldiers and civilians. The bypassed garrisons suffered a particularly cruel fate, slowly starving on islands that had become prisons, unable to fight, unable to surrender, unable to do anything but wait for a war to end. The strategy worked. It brought American forces from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay in less than 4 years. It defeated an empire that had seemed invincible. But the human cost, the Marines who died on Pacific beaches, the sailors who went down with their ships, the Japanese soldiers who starved on bypassed islands, the civilians caught in the crossfire, reminds us that even the most brilliant strategy cannot eliminate the horror of war. The island-hopping campaign stunned Japan and changed military history. But its true legacy is not just in the battles won or the strategy employed. It's in the thousands of graves scattered across Pacific islands, in the rusting hulks of ships on the ocean floor, in the memories of veterans who saw things no human should see. It's a reminder that war, no matter how necessary, no matter how brilliantly conducted, is always a tragedy. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all.